what an amazing privilege to speak to Sebastian Slovin. Obviously, if you look at what I've been doing, you're way too young for me to be reporting on your swimming career. But your dad was a special butterfly swimmer, Vernon Slovin. And as when I started with all these interviews, trying to sort of figure out what the history of South African swimming is, there was one name that sort of popped up when I spoke to Jeff Grills and Brian Stewart and all these legends of 1950 and especially 1960. And there was a name, Vernon Slovin, who was a butterfly swimmer. And yeah, I wanted to chat to him, but then sadly I heard from Kobus Skeepers that he passed away, and I started digging a bit and I stumbled upon your name. Sebastian, tell me, your dad, Vernon, he was an absolute South African swimming legend. Where did it all begin for him?
Yeah, he was indeed a legend. I'll share my version. I was quite young when he died, so some of the stuff is a lot of stuff from other people. But he grew up in Cape Town, and I think from a young age was super athletic and excelled in a lot of rugby, cricket, and different sports. But there was something about swimming that really, he loved it. Loved I think the competitive nature of it and all that stuff, and the challenge. And I think from a very young age he started competing. What's the place called? Is it I'm gonna butcher this, but is it Long Street Baths or something like that?
Yeah.
There's the yeah. I think that's where he started to swim, and then he was in I don't know all these names, but anyway, he started to compete there, and then kind of worked his way up the ranks, became a Springbok, and then that opened his world up to traveling, competing internationally, and eventually he came out to SMU in Dallas, Texas, Southern Methodist University, and yeah, things opened up from there.
So I did a bit of research on Kobus Skeepers. Got a great website on the history of South African swimming, and there's some very nice photographs and a bit of history on your dad's swimming. But if I'm correct, he was 19 years old when he got selected for I think it's 1964 swimming tour to Britain, and I think in Europe, they swam in Europe as well. So he was quite young, 19 years old, and he swam with legends, guys like Jeff Grills were in the team with him as well.
Yeah, no, he was. Yeah, I think that sounds right from what I heard for sure.
Yeah. And I actually had the privilege to speak to Jeff earlier today, because I asked Jeff to give me a bit of background on the legend Vernon Slovin. And Jeff, funny guy that he is, he says, Vernon was the untidiest guy I've ever met. He used to freak his roommates out. He left everything on the floor, and he just picked up the shirt or whatever he did. He said, but when he was in the swimming pool, he was meticulous, and he was the hardest worker that Jeff said that he's ever seen. In fact, he says he often stayed behind after training sessions and did extra work. So
yeah,
good legend.
That's awesome. I mean, that's super aligned with a lot of things that I heard. And a lot of my stories and stuff came probably later when he was in college at Southern Methodist University, and his swimming roommate and fellow swim teammate, a guy named Lyden Newman from the States, shared with me similar stories about he was roommates with him. So I think that is true about the messiness, and then equally is true about the intensity and attention to detail when he was in the pool and all around his training and stuff like that.
Jeff also shared with me, he said that people like to hang out with your dad because he had an incredible sense of humor. I mean, you were quite young. You were 6 when he passed away. What do you remember from, obviously he wasn't swimming anymore when you came around, not competing, but obviously you guys spend a bit of time in the water, I'm sure. I mean, he must have been a water boy all his life.
Yeah, for sure. And he was competing. He was doing masters, I think, when I was quite young.
Okay.
It's So he was still competing and doing a lot of open water swim. So I grew up with that, around that. It probably wasn't the same level as when he was a Springbok or when he was in college, but I was around it from day one. And I grew up in a little coastal town called La Jolla. It's a really beautiful place. It's actually, you've seen it or seen pictures of it. It's very similar to Cape Town in terms of the just iconic kind of rocky coastline and beautiful little coves and stuff like that. So I grew up learning how to swim in the ocean with my dad before I could probably even walk. I was out there holding on to his around his neck, and he'd kind of swim me out. at this place called the Hoya Cove. And a lot of my early memories were just him taking me out way farther than I was where I cared to go on my own, he was just sort of this, almost like superhuman like figure to me.
That's incredible,
And
because I remember my dad, who passed away 16 years ago, and my memories of my dad was also swimming in Strand behind the waves, hanging onto his shoulders, being petrified of the big waves, and this rock of a man and so I think it's similar memories. It's incredible that those memories, they last for a lifetime. So glad
for
you
sure. Yeah. And I remember I would he would ride waves, body surfing, and I'd just be holding on to him like a surfboard. And I think, I don't remember this as much, but I think he was really a funny guy, like had a great sense of humor and always, tried to bring that to, a lot. I've heard, lots of funny stories from his college roommates and that.
That's awesome. He swam in 64, and then he got a scholarship to go to SMU University, and I think he spent 4 years in Southern Methodist. And then he came back. I think during that time, he was ranked third in the world I'm not sure if it was the 100 and 200 or just the 200. I think the 200 butterfly was his special event. I read somewhere that he held the South African record for the 200 butterfly for 19 years. That is,
wow.
That is pretty incredible. Right. But then he came back in 69. He made the Springbok team again in 69. But there was a guy called John Cater from Rhodesia, who was a 19-year-old. And I actually made contact with John last week. Spoke to John on the telephone.
You did?
Yeah, and I'm going to do an interview with him. And people still talk about the 1969 Currie Cup in Cape Town, where John Cater and your dad, and there was another swimmer, I think your dad placed third in the one event. But they touch within a split second, a hundredth of a second of each other. And it's a race that people till today, they talk about the 200 butterfly race that was swum in 1969.
Yeah. I've heard about that, read a little about it. In fact, just, so funny, just yesterday or the day before, I don't know if you know this person, but a really close friend of my dad's, a guy named John David Kennedy. He grew up in South Africa and grew up in Johannesburg, swam, I guess when it got too cold in Cape Town in the winter, he would go to Johannesburg to train, and he stayed with this guy, John David's family. But he just sent me via Facebook, he just sent me an article about that race. And it was such a funny timing because I know you had mentioned it, but it sounded like an epic battle and super tight race.
Well, I've got great news. So we'll hear John Cater's version of that as well. And John just mentioned something, and I think they wrote about it in the newspapers as well, that apparently in the mid 60s there was this thing in America where people would psych each other out. So they talked to their competitors before and they tried to psych them out. And your dad obviously learned from the Americans competing against them, and he came to South Africa and he used that tactic against the 19-year-old John Cater. But we'll get his side of the story when I chat to him as well and find out.
Yeah, I would love to hear what kind of smack talking was going down. Yeah. Apparently, it didn't quite work, but yeah, it's a good tactic.
Yeah, I think sometimes it doesn't work on too young. When you're 19 years old, you can conquer the world. I think that type of talking starts working when you're a bit older and you lose a bit of confidence in the power. The one thing that Jeff Grills mentioned this morning, he says your dad, a lot of guys had a lot of good technique, and he remembers your dad from swimming from his strength. So he was an incredibly strong person. Maybe physically strong, but also strong-willed and strong-minded as well. So that's why I think he was in the Springbok team until 1970 or 71 even. I saw pictures of him in the Springbok team. And he swam with absolute legends of South African swimming. Obviously, he was one of them as well. Someone I'll interview in December is a guy who I met. I actually swam with him, is Lee McGregor, who became one of the all-time greats. So sure to get a bit of inside stories on your dad from Lee as well. Sebastian, so obviously after your dad stopped swimming, I see he did an MBA as well. So he then went into business. And he was very successful in that. Where were you guys living then? Because at one stage you guys were living in Australia as well.
Right, yeah. So he got his MBA, then moved out to San Diego and did really well, right? Was a stockbroker, did really well in business. And, I think it's interesting. I was thinking about how you mentioned his strength in the pool, right? And I've heard stories too where when he was in the States, he was coached at one point by, I don't know, he's spacing on these people's names. It was a person who was the U.S. Olympic coach and was giving him pointers. And my dad, I guess, just didn't want anything to do with his pointers. He's like, I haven't figured it out. And it was basically just like this mind over matter, like really intense determination, which got him a lot of success, right? In the pool and in business. And it was, I also kind of think the same kind of thing that got him into trouble a little bit with business, where he set these goals and he would charge forward, but it was kind of like he'd do anything to achieve these, whether it was financial goals or physical goals or whatever. And he got into, like a difficult spot with business, ended up losing a lot of money. And that was when I was quite young. So a lot of this is just, I heard it from other people, but wanted to kind of start over. And that was the trip to Australia. So we immigrated from San Diego to initially Melbourne, there for a while. And he had some South African friends and family and stuff in Australia. So he had some connections there and kind of wanted to start over. And that worked well for a while. We were there for about a year, but I think he still, wanted to make the kind of money he could in the States. And so there was a lot of, I think, competing priorities for him. I can't tell you exactly what he was thinking, but that was kind of the beginning of him starting to struggle more and more with his mental health when we moved to Australia.
Okay. I think, that competitive spirit and wanting to be the best and wanting to be first, it needs to be balanced out as well. And sometimes it can get a hold of you. And I know a lot of guys had the mantra that first is first and second is last, or second is nothing.
Right.
And that's quite not too many people can come first. I mean, the times that I came first in my life, I can count on my one hand. The rest of the time, I was lucky if I was second, I was further down the line. And it can be a difficult thing. And in business as well, you can't always win. So sadly, the stuff that helped your dad in his early part of life was actually maybe counting against him in the latter part of his life.
For sure. Yeah, I think that was definitely, again, from what I heard from other people, his mantra. It was like, if you're not first, like, what are you doing? It doesn't, you should basically quit, which is, I really appreciate that competitive nature. And I think, but I learned a lot of stuff from hearing these stories and from what happened to him. But it was, like, just like you said, like having something to balance it out, or because you eventually, you can't be the first in everything. Physically, you're going to get, and I think that's also, he was getting older, he was slowing down physically. And I think it was kind of a combination of things, but it was also, this just difficulty adapting or accepting not being the best anymore.
Yeah. I have the philosophy in life that maybe it comes from my biblical background, is that anything can be turned into something good. And I mean, losing a dad at such a young age, I mean, I can't fathom that that anything good can come out of it. But you've sort of worked your way through. It took you a long while. Tell me about the process, how you ended up. I read that a family member spoke to you when the penny sort of dropped, but you struggled a lot in the beginning to make sense of it all.
Yeah, for sure. I think, I grew up very much, I think my dad passed that mentality along to me, when I was young. And I think he died when I was 6, right? He died by suicide. So I think it's important for listeners that don't know that he took his own life. And, it just completely flipped my world upside down. And it was a big shock to, obviously, to us and to my mom and sister. And, I really struggled for a long time after that. I feel like my dad was such a big part of my life, such, as I mentioned, this larger than life hero figure. And I felt like he was invincible. And then all of a sudden he was just gone. Right. Yeah. And I think I really struggled. I felt like, I remember the story shortly after my dad died. I had just started competing in swimming. And there was this swimming competition called the La Jolla Rough Water Swim, which is an annual rough water swim that my dad, I think he won like 10 times or something like that. Oh. And I grew up with these trophies and these medals in the hallway. And I was set to, the year he died, I was set to competed in it for the first time. I was like 6 years old, and they have this kids course, you know, smaller course. And I remember really vividly just I trained hard to go to it, and I couldn't get myself out of bed. My mom was trying to get me to go, and I just totally refused because I knew that this is my mindset.
Yeah.
If I didn't win, I would be kind of ashamed to my dad's memory, and I was so much pressure to win at that age that I couldn't even compete. So I kind of bailed on swimming. Eventually, I was, I think, very fortunate to have. I went through, you know, a number of pretty dark years, but my early connections with nature when I was with my dad as a youngster was what I think saved me. And you know, after he died, he was cremated. We spread his ashes in the ocean and at his favorite beach in La Jolla Cove. And I felt like no matter how bad things got, if I could just get to the beach, it was like I was with my dad again.
Oh, wow.
And just felt like that I kind of saw my family in that whole environment, or saw him in that environment. So that was like my therapy. You know, if things got really bad at school or wherever, I would just get to the ocean. And I ended up becoming obsessed with bodyboarding, boogie boarding, right? And started to compete and end up finding my passion and some purpose that way. Yeah, that's a long story, but I want to kind of fast forward a little bit to when I was a teenager. When I was 17, I was doing okay. I was doing my bodyboarding stuff competitively, but outside of that, I was pretty much a mess, and, you know, not doing very well in school, and, you know, drinking too much, and just kind of like really not a, you know, sustaining lifestyle. I ended up having the chance to go to Australia to do some bodyboarding and to visit with some family friends, and stayed with this guy who I mentioned earlier, John David Kennedy, a guy who grew up with my dad. And my dad died in Perth, and I was in Perth. And so right up until this point, I hadn't really even talked to anyone about my dad's death. I kind of had, it was this thing that I sort of buried beneath the surface, and there's all sorts of shame and stigma around suicide and mental illness and stuff like that. And I remember the first day I was in Australia, John David invited me to go on a walk, and we walked down by the Canning River, a super beautiful area. And I was nervous because I felt like John David was going to start asking me about my dad, and I was going to have to talk about it, and I didn't want to go there.
Okay.
And he just starts to share, and he transitions to share how heartbreaking that his dad, so John David's dad, took his own life when he was a kid.
Oh,
so
wow.
he had been through this. Yeah, so he had been through the same thing that I had gone through, and I hadn't spoken to anyone who had experienced that. And he shared with me how he tried to run away from it for many years, and it didn't work. And eventually he was going to have to face it and talk about it. And that morning, that day, I felt for the first time ever that he was someone who knew what I was going through, and I could talk about it. And it was this kind of the beginning of a complete turnaround for me, where it wasn't like everything was solved, but it was the turnaround for me, kind of avoiding my dad's death and not talking about it or thinking about it, to facing it and, you know, seeing what I could learn from it. And it sent me off on this journey to talk to more people who knew him and learn about him, like all the different aspects of him. And it was an amazing thing, but it was incredible that just one conversation could make such a profound impact.
That is incredible to hear. And okay, so you said you were about 17 years old when this conversation happened.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Talk to me about the book and the process. I mean, what happened there? How did you start off on that? Because that's quite a mean task to write a book. I mean, and open up. So.
Yeah. So that conversation was very much the beginning of that process, and I remember, you know, I ended up having a wonderful time in Australia. Reconnected with a lot of my dad's friends, and it was amazing. And I remember on the way back to the long flight back to California, I wrote down a list of everyone who I could think of who knew my dad well that I could go and talk to. And including, I mean, sounds nuts, but I hadn't even really talked to my mom about my dad's suicide. You know, it was something we just didn't really talk about in my family. And so that was a long process, probably 10 years or so, of one by one having these intense conversations. And it was really overwhelming at first. And I found myself just kind of completely taken over. I'd be either angry or sad, to feel again, learning how to live again, feel my emotions again. But that was really those conversations ended up being, I was realizing that I had learned these lessons from my dad's suicide that I wanted to share with other people, and particularly with other people who had dealt with suicide or dealt with someone in their family who had, dealt with depression or mental illness, and really wanted to, I think my goal with the book was to do the same thing that John David did for me, which is to start the conversation, to open things up so that other people can kind of take it from there. And that was really, it was tough to write it, but I'm really grateful. And it was a healing process for me to write it, for sure.
That's incredible to hear. And obviously this put you on a career path. I mean, you still today still mentor and talk to people that's gone through similar experiences. And
yeah,
I mean, that's the one side of the coin, but you also, I guess, find people that are, suicidal and are having thoughts of, I mean, you mentioned that at one stage you thought it wasn't worth living yourself either. So, I mean, you've found that side of the coin as well.
For sure. Yeah. And I think this is before that trip to Australia. And I was very much in a place where I felt like, felt very much like I think my dad felt, and that, if I couldn't be the best, a lot of it was around this kind of thing about being the best, but yeah, it was such a, huge part of my life, it was a real bad, a major trauma, and there's wonderful things that eventually came out of it. But I think there's a place in my heart that I'm really passionate about having these conversations so more people talk about it. So, I think if my dad, I can't say this for sure, but had people to, that he could talk about and open up to, and it would be maybe a different story. But that's a big part of my passion. And I, also do a lot of stuff around, some stuff around the suicide prevention. That's really a big thing for me. And then also getting folks, especially now with people who are more on devices than ever before, especially young people, getting people outside into the ocean, into the water, out into the mountains. I'm really passionate about just the benefits of getting people outside off their devices.
Yeah. As we are speaking, you're currently in the mountain and at a retreat, and you actually going to be speaking to a lot of people. Something that I just thought as we were talking now that, today we talk about things 20, 30, 40 years ago, men didn't speak about anything. They always put this brave face up, everything's fine. But inside, as you said, inside it can be a mess. And I think, you can speculate all your life, but maybe in the modern days like today, when people get the opportunity to speak, they deal with stuff differently, and things could work out differently, for sure. I mean, the stigma, as you said, just to mention the word suicide was stigmatized in back in the days.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, when I spoke with John David, when he first shared with me about his experience with his dad, so this would have been in the 50s, right? And when his dad died, I think, and 50s, 60s, and no one, it was, the amount of stigma was so intense. And then even for my dad in the 90s, right? Where 80s and 90s when he was going through, and that's, it's wonderful to see that things are changing. I think about that, you mentioned in the beginning, like he had this, I think, larger than life, my dad had this larger than life sort of, he was super charismatic and jovial and funny. And then there was this flip side, which I think he didn't feel like he could bring to the surface, right? And maybe if, I think that's what I'm interested in. You can still have the jovial stuff, but it's like, you can't just feel, the good stuff and try and hold back the shadow side, if you will.
Yeah, that's incredible, and people who perform at a very high level, they also experience things at a very high level, and there's just such a difference between the very highs and the very lows. Some
For
people
sure.
go through life like this, and then some people are there, and then they're here, and then they're there, and luckily today we have people that we can talk to and share their experiences, and the only way to deal with stuff is to actually get it out there and address it.
I'll say too, I want to add too that I think there can be this mindset that if you kind of are more accepting or whatever, then you can't still compete at a high level. But I think you can really compete and be highly competitive, have that same type of tenacity, and and also, have more balance as well. I don't think it's one or the other is what I'm saying. Like there's there can be a mindset that like if my dad or someone like that were to accept being second best, it wouldn't have pushed him to be. But I think you can find motivation in different ways, and that you can still compete at a really high level, and stay alive.
So, thinking back of the guys you spoke to from your dad's swimming career, anybody stood out for you? There were some interesting characters you spoke to from the swimming side. I mean, I see your dad competed even with legendary swimmers like Karen Meir. He was in the swimming team with Karen Meir as well, who sadly had passed away as well.
There's shoot, I wish I knew more about like the South African heritage and some of those guys, but I think I had a great conversation with someone I'm still close with today, a person named Richard Bonney, who swam with my dad at SMU. He's a few years behind him, but we're still very close. And I just like, there's so many stories, but just even the rough water swims. This is when my dad's a little older. This thing, like, I forget how, I'm maybe gonna not get this right, but it was something like 3 months before the actual event, he almost became like a complete germaphobe. Like before he was like going out and having dinner, and then he'd only, he'd like, I don't want to risk getting sick, for the swim, and just it was like, he just was so intensely focused on preparation. And I also, this is not a story from a swimmer, but a great story that I think about often is from one of his business partners, a guy named Reed Thompson, who sadly passed away about a year ago. But my dad and him worked together and were very close. But there was a story, I'll send you the article if I can find it, but there was this newspaper article done where my dad was just down at the beach, I think at a place called Sea, which is a popular beach in La Jolla. I think he had just gone for a swim, and then I think a handful of people, like 3 or 4 people, got caught in a rip current and were getting pulled out to sea. And it was after the lifeguards were off duty, and he went out and single-handedly rescued everyone.
Oh wow!
And it was in the paper, and it was this big thing. And I remember this guy Reed told me, he was like, the next day he heard about the story, he saw it in the paper, and Reed went up to my dad. He's like, well, Vernon, weren't you scared that they were gonna pull you under, or drown you? He's like, and I think like deadpan, I'm not gonna be able to do it right. He's like, no one could drown me. Something like that. And just like, it was like completely serious. It was like, totally like ego, like kind of cocky, but like Reed just laughed and they both had a chuckle. But Reed told me, he's like, he was like, Reed actually like completely believed that no one could take him under. You know what I mean? He was like that headstrong. And
I think he believed it himself,
for sure. Yeah.
That's probably what made him such a fierce competitor, is that he believed in himself. I mean, self-belief is number one. At that level, everybody is good enough to win, but it's the one who believes they can win that in the end ends up in front. Sebastian, any contact with South Africa yourself?
A little bit, yeah. I think unfortunately, this is after my dad died, there was a lot of, again, the stigma thing, right? Like I felt, I just have my own side of the story, but I was pretty cut off. My mom, my sister and I were cut off from my South African roots. He had, there was some like challenging relationship with his brother who was in the States, but that was also a connection for me to South Africa. And so I didn't really talk to any of my family in South Africa for a really long time. And then maybe about 10 years ago, I got back in touch with my dad's cousin, Robert Spence, who's in Cape Town, and making a trip back out, and had a wonderful, spent about a month in South Africa, went to Cape Town, went up to Johannesburg and did Kruger, and then kind of all along the coast down, and ended up connecting with a lot of family and friends and people that knew my dad. And so I'm still in touch with some of them, but haven't been out in a while and would love to come back out soon. It's I feel so connected to that country, even though I didn't spend much time there.
It'll be lovely to have you in person, but to go to the Facebook page and connect with the South African swimmers on the Facebook page. It's a vibrant group. There's some lovely stories, and your dad's name was popped up in a lot of those stories. So
For sure.
Sebastian, it's absolutely incredible to speak to you, and hopefully this is the first of many times that we connect. Enjoy the mountains. You can be incredibly proud of your dad and what he's achieved, and he is a big part of South African swimming history. And I'm sure through this interview and through this short video that we've made, we will keep his legacy alive and kicking.
Yeah, absolutely. That's my hope. And, he's such an amazing person. And I'm grateful for you for putting this on and for inviting me on. And it's such an amazing way to honor my dad and to keep these stories going,
Well, he deserves to be kept in the minds of the South African swimmers. Sebastian, thank you so much, and be safe and be blessed, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon, and maybe we can body surf a wave or two one day, or maybe do a rough water swim together.
Yeah. I would love to. Yeah, I look forward to getting out in the water with you for sure.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it.
All right. Likewise. Thank you.